successfully.
Alright, I'm unmuting the mic now, so.
Okay, sounds good. Good to know. Now we'll stop talking shit about Fricker.
That's when you're supposed to stop. That's when you're supposed to sit and talking shit about.
No, like it's no shit was
Love you, Brett Brick.
Alright. Black women are the hardest working women, and Americans still get no respect. No woman has done so much for this country and received so little. Really, black women built this country. It all started right here between the blueberry black, chocolate cream, honey brown, praline pecan, French vanilla legs. It wasn't the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, the Stars and Stripes that gave birth to America. It was rather the black vagina that laid the golden egg, or rather the chattel slave. That's right. During America's formative years, the most valuable property to be produced of property. The entire economy was the property of slaves. $12 billion worth. One can't begin to fathom today's dollars. Where did it all come from? Whose vaginas passed this $12 billion? Whose vagina was capitalized, colonized, immortalized to give birth to America, whose vaginas have been appropriated, syndicated, deprecated, but never ever vindicated in the process of building this country. The black vagina, the only vagina that was less valuable when it was loved and protected than it was when it was open, occupied, and taken at will. And the law made it that way. Black women couldn't be raped as a matter of law during the old days. The law said that rape was something that only happened to white vaginas, not to black ones. Politics must begin from the position of the black matrix of black women whose local structural position of rape. This conception does not formulate rape as an incident which happens when are more or less vulnerable to, but rather the very condition for being a black woman by extension in the world in which those slaves built. Willerson says no slave, no world. We say no black woman, no slave, and no world. That's James 13. Flights, captivity, and communal conceptual wellness created the room philosophers, habitat, boundary defining democracy, realism, attitude, and German phenomena, but democracy, boundary defining freedom through captivity, marine philosophy, the borders, reimagining freedom through flight, habit, reproductivity, points of black matrix, is symbolic, material subjugation, Peru, the marine capital, racial shadows, racial rape, senior, racial gender differences, masculine, suffering, falling of the black female, trauma to the black male, frame, death, row, mass, and prison, stop and frisk, are all focused on violence in the public. The bear is complicated, moral through all blood trails, traceable back to the black matrix, focus on the nature of the subjugators, sensories, and sheer space and colonization, sacrification, black women's matrices have no public record. The black matrix offers deniability, state and intimate violence, further stores meet Western democracies, manufacture black matrix is disposable through libidinal, linguistic, and material economies, and those times of alienation and degradation were the old days. We can rest assured now, right? We finally got that respect that Aretha's been talking about all these years, or did we? Has black woman received the respect she deserves even today? Are we respected when those who enter our body least against our will are least likely to be arrested, least likely to be prosecuted, least likely to be convicted? Are we respected when black trans women have 50% homicide rate, but convictions for those murders is less than 5%? Are we respected when no one seems to care what happens to our bodies in our own communities? Is the black woman respected when our own community readily embraces those accused of rape, chastised women for not having the good sense God gave her, having no business being up there with that man at 2 in the morning, and being foolish not to know what her brother's 2 intentions were? Black women respected when everyone knows the names of Michael Brown, John Crawford, Eric Garner, but no one really knows the names of Mia Henderson, Tiffany Edwards, and Brittany Sturgis. Is the black woman respected when politicians trip over themselves trying to be tough on black women, by some miracle are convicted, only receive 1/5 the sentence? Those who rape white women by embracing the punitive policies to sew up and shut down these women now their labor isn't needed anymore, and all black women defined as prostitutes, while the experience of black sex workers has been rendered invisible in the politics of respectability. That's Blair and 10. Black prostitute is alongside symbol and principle for black women's sexuality in the place of African American society called arms, middle class black women. All black women are defined as prostitutes through equation black women with prostitution generates respectivity on behalf of the respectable black women. Black persons themselves remain public in the science which public discourse. The science about prostitution's virtues of black women and science essential to politics respectability, because this politics respectability silence has also shaped our own experience of African American men and women, and anti-blackness manifests the politics of respectability uniquely through ignoring the experience of black trans women. This violence of civil society magnifies the anti-blackness in wish-watching year. That's Trudy and 14. Tiffany Edwards, C.C. Domia Henderson, Brittany Nicole Sturgis are all recent sampling of young black trans women who face death at astronomical rates, colorism, economic violence, BSM, misfortune specific to trans misogyny, and there's so many intersecting approaches when it's regulate lives. When just violence on black women discuss which alludes to the ways in which a socially accepted hatred and oppression of black men in general amplifies for black trans women. Even in death, anti-blackness never allows to be death for be the final act for trans people. Black trans women have experience has not been included, and when I see politic of illicit eroticism is essential to challenging trans misogyny. Jeanette Mock reminds us we need a space for the erotic, the messy, the struggle, complicated in our politics. We need a space to discuss the unspoken, uncomfortable, dark truths. We need a space to challenge the exceptionalism that polices and the boundaries of gender and black womanhood. You should orient your ballot to confront the politics respectability that perpetuates the libidinal economy of anti-black consumption, that devalues the black female body through violent imagery, objectification, cultural shaming that manifests itself through policy regulation of sex work. You should reject their framing of our bodies and endorse the methodology hypersexual autonomy to change the economies of representation. That's Young and 10. African American women's sexuality is inherently informed by the objectification of bodies necessitated by the sexual economy, save for black women's historical efforts to reclaim their bodies, define their own womanhood. Black women have also challenged the dominant matching of black sexuality as pathological, using the sexual autonomy in the face of widespread discourse to sexual deviancy. Women defining sexual autonomy has not been easy. Politics of respectability has historically discouraged black women, creating a framework outside of sexual subjectivity, outside of heteronormative domestic bourgeoisie family relations, rape for rape, sexuality gendered in favor of being aesthetic heterosexual narrative. The politics of respectability proposed that black women have a cultural dissemblance, secrecy, disavow, and sexuality in black women's license to cultural traditions, frame sexual deviance as dangerous, marginalized women who deviate from politics, respectability, and dissemblance by participating in non-normative sexuality. This including queer, contractual, public sexuality, restrictive, repressive, dangerous aspects of black female sexuality has been emphasized, while feminist writers have emphasized that the agency has gone under analysis which interrogate the sexual desires, fantasies, fetishes, expressions of black sexual subjects, as well as a white male, presumed white male versus a consumer, and the figure of the prostitute is a socialized, racialized, deviant body, does not conform to the norms of acceptable behavior, which makes her a monstrous, dangerous other, that's a on innate. Contagious prostitute, deviant black body, and the bodies that engage in prostitution, space of prostitution are racialized through the deployment of the trope of the monstrous body, racialized others that are disabled, plus the rest of the norm to contract the clean and proper body strength and normative standards, so powerful the prostitute. Books of fascination, hoarsely, dangerously recross the subject-object binary, but when certain public framings and certain public framings are always already transgressive, dangerous, and in danger, and the policing of prostitution perpetuates racialized violence. That's Talk 92. The policing of prostitutes as racial degeneracy, black immigrant migrant workers are subject to systematic violent harassment. The police use control for prostitution as a cover for policing minority, immigrant, and working class communities, both male and female. Defining zones of the city is sexually deviant. The police attempt to penetrate and subdue the black body policy through prostitution. Last space is criminalized. Prostitutes who are poor and black make the most vicious rental law in the U.S. Women of color make up 55% of those sent to jail, thereby ensure that the poor black women pay the heaviest price for criminalization of sex work. The horror stigma divide is a racial divide, stigmatizing and endangering lives of women of color, as well as perpetuating racism in the sex industry in the U.S. and after 400 years, this is the respect we've been waiting for? I don't think so. So here's an idea. The next time we hear rebelting, R-E-S-B-E-C-T, let's reach for it, own it, proclaim it as our national anthem for black women, for black vaginas, because we know the respect only goes out to those who demand it and refuse to live without it. So from Harlem to Watts, Memphis, Detroit, from Nairobi to Beijing, let our voice demand our command be heard. Respect this woman is in the battle cry for respect. The black woman represents a pivot towards illicit eroticism, self-autonomy, which is key to challenging paternalistic representations of black female body and disrupt erotic economies of white desire. Self-commodification is the best methodology. Recognize a pleasure and believe in black female sex workers both a strategy of survival, but also an active self-expressive erotic desire that's young and 10. Black women are finding new ways to put embodiment to work and sexuality to work and often informal labors of sex. Nothing about eroticization, transnational economies desire. The sexual labor is an integral part of many third working lives and strategies through the historical representation of black female bodies of aspirate for forbidden sexual desires, fantasies, fetishes, how black subjects symbolically and strategically within prohibited terrain of sex. Illicit eroticism offers a framework to understand black subjects in the sexual labor market and sexual economy. Illicit eroticism offers black women who are marginalized formal labor market ways to survive and prosper, encompassing a wide range of informal intimate market labors. Illicit erotic workers employ their sexual capital talents, knowledges, or perform sexual services on the margins of the economy, increasingly focused on commodification, intimacy, eroticism, issues, the logic, respectability, dissemblance, normativity. Black women transgress multiple moral, cultural, social boundaries as they outlaw the racialized sexuality work. They use the demand for the mythic, hypersexual vehicle to reproduce themselves, which demands the selective appropriation, self-commodification, both strategic and creative, with its engagement with capitalism, and we control uniqueness. Black women's bodies are already hyper-visible, and the status quo in their sexuality is rendered illicit. Only harnessing sexual visibility allows for black women to cultivate agency over their own desire and self-expression that's young and 10, participating in continuing illicit labor. Black women strategically maneuver the illicit erotic economy, promote their survival, autonomy, well-being, highly flexible income, working sense of recognition, their erotic embodiment, sexual talents. This kind of sexual visibility reflect desire. Young black women harness subjective eroticism, made popular black actresses and interchange sexual outlets like Lil' Kim, Richie, Sophie, and Baker, and thus, Talisa and I are from the legalization of the prostitute. Legalization is a social discursive strategies. Our understanding of prostitution must end from careful analysis of construction, or else our policy prescriptions and advocacy will always dangerously universalize and essentialize the prostitute experiences. That's in 97. It's common to talk about prostitution existing in universality differences in the social and cultural context. Normative sexual practices shape the significance of the structure of prostitution in any particular history. That move encourages us to forget the variety of meanings single practice can have for different individuals. Context is essential in prostitution. How participants experience and practice might play a crucial role. Context is key to understanding prostitution. Must be discursive through interpreted, and adequate understanding requires multiplicities, continuities, and the experience of prostitution between participants, as well as the dominant narratives of the culture at large.
So why is the demand for legalization important?
We say that we should legalize the prostitute. Our argument is that the way that black women are structured in the status quo is open to violence because there exists a politics of respectability that cultivates the stigma and the racial divide against.
So the politics of respectability is something that needs to be challenged. So the connection between legalization and challenging that politics is what I'm wondering about. So
Our
what
argument is that,
legalization?
well, right. Our argument is that we've defined legalization as a social discursive practice to deconstruct the way that laws are created. Our argument is that law is a living, breathing artifact that is created by the social norms that govern and police women, aka the welfare queen, the Jezebel. All of these things exist in a form of politics in which the law replicates the social.
After the plan says that we need to understand prostitution as sex work. This seems to fundamentally deny that there's an essential identity of the prostitute. How do we kind of overcome that?
Right. No, our argument is rather that prostitution cannot be understood through an essentialized context because experience differs for different bodies.
That's kind of where I want to get.
But our argument is that the structural position of the prostitute is what creates that racial divide and stigma, which is essential to understanding.
The distinction between the prostitute and prostitution is really important here. So the structural position of the prostitute is something that cannot be changed. Is that correct?
Our argument is that the structural if we went solvency for the app.
They're in the position of racial rape. That doesn't mean that we can't have agency. Our argument is our agency.
But are all black women prostitutes?
Our argument.
All black women are relegated to the position.
All black women are black women.
Okay.
And our argument is that leads to criminalization, aka blackness can be articulated as a terrorist, a prostitute, all of those codes of deviancy label black women.
I guess why must politics begin in the position of the black matrix?
Right, our argument is that civil society, society as per usual, maintains its coherence off of black women as in the structural position of rape. Black women have to reproduce babies for civil society to kill off and maintain itself in its basic coherence.
Can products of the black matrix ever exist outside the state of abject?
Our argument, that's solvency for the AF, right?
You made the argument, right?
What's
Like,
the state of abject?
people are always reproduced for the
What
kind
is
of
the
cause
state
of
of
machine.
abject? I don't know what that means. I'm not
trying
trying.
It means reproduce for the state of machines. Yes, our argument is that black women are in a space of dereliction in the status quo. You reproduce products to be fungible. The one you see, if we went solvency, means that that's not
outside the state of fungibility.
Can those products ever exist outside of the state of fungibility? Again, that's a question of the solvency mechanism for the affirmative. We think we provided illicit erotic economies to escape the way that the current economy of desire works towards bodies. That's a solvency for the 1AC.
So, sorry, last question. What is a prostitute?
The prostitute is a racialized, socialized, deviant body that does not conform to the norms of acceptable behavior. The 1AC says that prostitute becomes a label for black women because we mark sexuality onto black skin and hypersexuality as a negative D.
Any regulations on the prostitution?
Respectability politics is a regulation.
Sorry?
Respectability politics is a regulation. It's a statute which governs how people operate within society. So yeah.
You were supposed to be paying attention.
He's just online shopping, so
Buy something else.
not really mainstream.
Should I ask online shopping for what?
I don't disclose my online shopping. 3 off? Was there is there like a case page too, or is that part of the order?
No.
No.
Yeah, I just like
Sorry.
Julie watched
It
that
is
video
dense.
where they're like, oh shit, yes,
I felt like it was safe in the 1C.
you're having entirely too.
start talking.
You're right, we are.
Alright,
The 1C.
pretty good.
First of all, the Topicality, our interpretation is the resolution should define the division of affirmative and negative ground. It was negotiated and announced in advance, providing both sides with a reasonable opportunity to prepare and engage in others and one another's arguments. This does not require the use of any particular style, type of evidence, or assumption about the role of the judge, only that the topic determined in the debate subject matter of the United States is collective term referring to the federal government, or states only to R9, the United States remains collective term of the U.S. side. The federal government grants and powers with the government and powers distributed strongly against institution to government. And the 50 states legalization includes decriminalization plus application of labor and employment regulation does not require any specific kind of regulation. Haley and now legislation complete decriminal of all involve deal of any special criminal legislation dealing with sexual interference activities and sexual can be prosecuted under general laws, legalization, laws complete decree, coupled with positive legal provisions regulating what or more aspects of sexual or typical options, labor and employment law, or impact is procedural fairness, a limited point of stasis is necessary for effective limits which provide equitable ground to both sides. It does not exclude their content, but does require them to be topical. There's no substitute for procedural fairness, which side argumentation that's willing to put itself on trial, absent of prepared and depth focused debate becomes meaningless because we can't actually test one another's arguments without modest predictability to be able to prepare and debate it from the beginning. Next off is the prosecute case with applying one theoretical lens to prostitution, homogenizes diverse material conditions and axes of power standards and all the prostitution contingent in diversity of structures under which materializes this recognizing complete complex conditions under which sexual labor is exchanged concentration non-Western perspective highlights how the transnational socio-cultural and economic structures are influenced by local lifestyles, early patterns, sexual norms, experiences, races, colonial histories, and sexual school that calls for a discourse space for transformative theory which seeks to utilize the potentially counter-hegemony subject to hierarchical relations. Understanding the prostitute as an ontologically oppressive position homogenizes the diverse experiences, backgrounds, and projects of sex workers. The affirmative rise of discourse of support for oppression paradigm or alternative is to legalize sex work. Weeds or 11 this oppression paradigm depicts all sexual commerce and institutionalized subordination of women regardless of the conditions under which it occurs. The fact that commerce and domination and exploitation of variables we consider some core ontological features of sexual commerce contrast this with the monolithic and contrast this monolithic paradigm with an alternative one that recognizes substantial variation in sex work. This polymorphous paradigm holds there is a broad constellation of work arrangements, power relations, personal experiences among participants in the sexual commerce. Polymorphism is sensitive to complexities into the structural conditions shaping the uneven distribution of workers' agency and subordination. Next off is counter-hegemony, starting with the totalizing. I'll give you some time. Starting with the totalizing frame of the black matrix cycles political theory and activity to confront racial subordination. Figure 4. Slavery in the struggle against it provides us a safer than epistemological and moral advantage. She can recognize what remains hidden from the bachelor's view. One of the implications of the cultures of the Black Atlantic offered an opportunity to transcend the unproductive debate between the Eurocentric rationalism, which manifests as slavery experience, and anti-humanism. There was an odd silence when it comes to the events that are at the core of the history of the Black Atlantic. The central movement, Gilmore strategy, and current contest story. Black Atlantic. The shift from history to memory, slavery becomes the fabric of communal experience. It becomes a referent that continues to reproduce a modern experience of catastrophe, but remains curiously inanimate. Slavery received for to reach human. The African passive figures exclusively as a recourse of the discourse, as a recourse of discourse and events such as the French Revolution and the Revolution and Saint Domingue, the struggle against slavery in the Atlantic are barely mentioned instead of a substantive account of emancipatory goals. What were they? Were past the Gilroy offers a critique of the discursive regulations that govern emancipatory accounts of the past. Majority remains the master's domain. The slave is forever condemned to recall the memory. Critique of regulatory which achieves the slave's relation to history is that of insertion, not a construction. A critique of universality can be so confident. The majority against which critiques are directed is the same as that of the age of revolution. We will divide it. It is difficult to understand how the gaps and silences and hegemonic concepts of majority ever came into being instead of equating majority with the Eurocentric regime of racial subordination and then imposing that majority with a counterculture that grows out of suffering. We need to understand the culture of political conflicts that led to the majority that could be claimed only by European nations. In the clashes between conflicting emancipatory projects, we see divergent concepts of majority progress and liberty. Only careful consideration of the cultural and historical materials will tell us what kind of denial we are confronted with. That is what makes this notion workable for hermeneutical interpretations, unlike popular notions of trauma to which move the traumatic event into the realm of the unspeakable and render quite useless for critical purposes. The concept of disavow requires us to identify what is being disavowed by human blood and for what reason. Politics based on the black matrix and slavery as the paradigmatic institution for understanding colonialism produces a negative model of power, Scott. And for these questions played out in the game of political discourse that unreflexively presuppose that revolution, the concept that can and ought to continue to make a claim on our political calculations and our political hopes. That is precisely this assumption that has to be brought to question revolution understood as repetition of political orders already known in debates with displaced by a concept revolution to form a change that look forward to and unknown and novel. The derivative revolution is inseparable from larger derivative of majority and inseparable from those other cognitive, ethical, political categories that constitute and give point to that narrative categories such as nation sovereignty, progress, reason. We tend to wonder about what prevents satisfaction of our desires when we discover the obstacles to our satisfaction. We generate new objects of desire. A world with that obstacle to our satisfaction. Studies of revolution discontent have failed to adequately understand the role of social discontent. They have mistakenly focused on the way these concepts to find alternatives rather than the way they shape our understanding of these limitations themselves. They have been more concerned with the discovery of new ideals than with the discovery of new objects of discontent. How does James identify the particular problem with colonial slavery, and what is the connection between this and the anti-colonial story? The point and the conditions of my own post-colonial possibility. My point is to understand how the internal connection between the answer and between question and answer were constructed in a paradigmatic anti-colonial discourse. Colonial slavery is defined essentially its debasements, its burdens, its representations, its cruelties, its depredations, its humanities. What is crucial to an understanding of slavery is what it needed, that there was hardly another critical stance for adoption, that the demand for its immediate overthrow. If you identify the problem that colonialism is essentially one of degradation, then it's hard to offer any other kind of solution. The longing for anti-colonial revolution is inseparable from this image of colonialism. The idea that colonialism was constituted by, in essence, a totalizing principle of degradation became central to the construction of anti-colonial criticism. My point is a certain kind of politics has hitherto been derived the question of the answer constitute one integral language. The image of ours to be formulated a historical distance centered around the picture of colonial slavery. And we are to set aside the longing for total revolution that has so vitally animated anti-colonial politics and that continues to conquer post-colonial imagination. And we shall have to give up the idea that the crucial thing to demonstrate about the slave colonial past is its essential degradation and dehumanization. Vote negative to advocate engagement in counter-hegemonic struggles. The positionality of the black matrix as a side protection for the always abject is mutually exclusive with our co-wielding. This is true function of racial formation into racist political power and inputs of people of color and racial formation turns any positive potential for the affirmative only 1 into 13 and systemic racism across the political power and agency of people of color virtually disappear properties and it makes it difficult to understand how anti-racial mobilization could ever occur in the past or could ever make completely systemic racism like the Borg and Star Trek, a high that assimilates all it touches to race and racism should be distinguished. Racist realist consequences of race and racism do not exist merely because of white domination, but because of resistance and independent action of racial formation and fundamentally political racial formation proceeds to logic was signified counter race and they were counter races totally shaped by white racial frame. People of color have proper reduction of racial unity. Racism is the product of modern history and power slavery and genocide. Even about the resistance, this is where race comes from. The tribe to rule and the imperative to resist who is white. The question of whether there are any positive dimensions of white identity or whether it is a purely negative quality to races they lived in and lived out part of the structure of identity. The cease racism is more than racism. It is a social fact. Racial identities are not defined solely by the antagonism. The U.S. respect the racial democracy capable of being influenced towards and inclusive and redistributive policies or imperial policies. But U.S. racial conditions have changed. Some reforms in the 1960s have proved irreversible. These transformations were the results of political mobilizations led by the black movement, but not confined to blacks. Longevity precedes the incorporation of opposition. The civil rights and reforms can be seen as this process here. The racial regime was exercising hegemony, but such reforms are not merely be symbolic. If they are to be effective, opposition must win real gains in the process. We are in the normal policies, not absolute rule. There were important and partial victories that shifted the racial state from the victories can place on the determinant economic level of social interaction. By no means do we think the post-war movement was an unmitigated success. All new social movements were subjected to re-articulation that produced colorblindness and even their incorporation revealed the transformative character of the politicization of the social. In the context of prostitution, we should understand sex as work. Advocating against criminalization of sex work expresses solidarity. Criminality impacts all other aspects of sex workers' political participation. The counter-advocacy is a prerequisite for success of the affirmative grant in 14. Necessity brand an intersection movement that offers beneficial connection to migrants, tries to informal workers, to the degree sex work is a right safer place to come out, and other movements, those connections can be fostered into something powerful, and to the degree that stigma and criminalization makes that running sex workers will be more occupied, finding for survival, then finding solidarity, and also put this is what's absent of willingness to rest of supporting people who cannot encourage to change the conditions of sex workers' lives. This is where we lose circle of conversation about how sex work makes you feel. Only the candidate for taking action feelings about sex work do not make much difference to the police. If you have your feelings taken to the people who listen, health planning, labor unions, career and women's organization, what is needed for any regulations, recognition that under criminalization sex work is regulated by the criminal system, even for sex workers who work in the criminally culture management. The first step in talking about standards for sex work is to make space for sex workers to believe that processes will not happen so long as law enforcement are on sex workers' backs. If sex workers were not criminal, sex workers could do much more for themselves and for each other. There's no reason to wait for an attitude to change the horse and somehow fall the way to make room for another way. Whether that's amending the law and ending sex worker status as outlaws. Back to topicality, meaningful dialogue about what actions the government should take. What? Oh. Drysic 6. Pluralists begin by stress that how the interference of the marginalized groups are likely to be very different consensus concealed in the consensus oppression right after what to loss of indication of the differences move races and question in the terms of what is engaged with cross difference have proceeded. It's a matter of being open to conversation due to a democratic attitude for account of democracy, but because those people showing respect on the procedural rules of your discussion and decision making either promotes unregulated pluralism as an all to consensus to regulation cannot just be judged from your procedural from that, but applying anything goes in terms of substance, dogmatic assertion of identity, if you less essential resemblance have to be changed to make mechanism possible regulated principles communication from the substance of the kinds of claims that are worth things like these authors suspicious and sense of retreating from while division they need principles to regulate the substance of what belongs to debate.
Okay. What do you mean by dialogue?
Dialogue? A conversation between two equally prepared competitors and their
Do you mean like the dialogic model of conversation?
Dialogic model? No, the dialogic model as defined in like the academy is
Like
a focus on
Martin.
arriving at consensus. We do not believe that we need to arrive at consensus.
Can you say one more time? It's conversation between two equally paired. What? No, one more time. Because I'm writing this down. Can you say it again?
A conversation or debate between two equally prepared opponents.
Okay.
And that does not need to reach a consensus, or rather a dissensus, because it's a competition.
Okay.
Sounds good. Okay, what do you define sex work as?
We don't think there's like a singular interpretation.
Well,
or
you seem to
paradigmatic
agree that
understanding of sex work.
seeing it not as sex work is bad. I'm curious,
Wait.
what is sex work?
Okay, so sex work should be understood as being a very complex phenomena that is different from multiple times and spaces. This is opposed
Different
to a
from
monolithic
multiple
or
times and
paradigmatic
spaces.
understanding.
Why is the
Where's
labor
it-
that the prostitute does not part of sex work?
Oh, it is part of sex work.
What's the mutual exclusivity there?
We do not understand it kind of as a homogenous understanding, i.e. black women are all
question
positioned as
itself,
the
right?
prostitutes.
So
Did you read some evidence that says
the
that
question itself is
did
like,
you read some evidence that said civil society doesn't consider black women as prostitutes or whores or Jezebel?
We read evidence
or
that says the articulations of how black people are defined by civil society is a contingent articulation.
Sure, it
and
changes.
must be
Respectively, politics
re-articulated.
changes. We agree. Did you read evidence on the uniqueness
But you
question
say
about?
that the undergirding of those changes is always to force black women to reproduce fungible bodies for consumption by civil
Right,
society.
that's
And we are
the-
calling
that's
into
the
question
status
that
quo.
undergirding of the change. So
What
we
do you
don't
think
believe that
actually
undergirds
undergirds
are
the
a
That
change?
made no sense so clear. But
Wait,
go
wait,
ahead.
what do you think undergirds a change?
We think of that as contingent. We don't think there's like a natural
But
logic or a
contingent
process
means
of
that
history.
contingent means that if it was a political ontology, that we're not saying we're fucking Hegel, that black women are not placed into the capital O ontology of never changing.
But you
if
do
we
describe
indicate,
the role of all black
let
women
me
as being
finish.
for the.
Let me.
Okay.
Yep. If your evidence is about colonialism and the way that violence is contingent to a political ontology, which was what your evidence says, if the 1EC says that neoliberal governmentality means that we manipulate situations to place black women in certain ways,
Yes,
we
but-
challenge that.
but you say
How is
that-
the affirmative not
Hold on.
counter-hegemonic?
Hold on, you say the telos for that manipulation is always to overthrow modernity's understanding and placement of black women as being solely for the reproduction of
Really
fungible,
quick question.
reproduction
I
of
have a
fungible bodies to consume.
So the-
You are not counter-hegemonic.
So I have a question.
Okay.
The piece of evidence that you read says only careful consideration of the cultural and historical materials will tell us the kind of denial that we are confronted with. Why is the 1EC not a careful consideration of the cultural and historical materials of
Because
black
your
women?
positioning or understanding of the black woman as being situated as always prostitute understands prostitution as always being a position of exploitation
That's
or
incorrect.
subordination.
That's incorrect. Okay,
And
but
it's
now we're getting to where the
different.
link is. That's fine. I'm gonna take some breath. Sorry, I didn't mean to turn up on you, but I'm just really excited. Have a good day.
Do you think that means just stare at him?
Groups are we comparing to black women? But chain of equivalence.
It's not a comparison or an equivalence. It's
That's what you just said, chain of equivalence.
chain of equivalence is has
Okay,
some
I'm sorry.
similarities.
I'm
So
troubling myself.
workers,
Okay,
not
you're right.
black women,
I got
aren't
you.
exactly like other
I got you, I understand.
When the nephew used to run around going, "Pat off it, Sarah. I know what Emory needs." Because he walked in the kitchen one time. I was definitely just Emory behind Jeff. He's like, "They're frustrating me." He's like, "Oh, this is so bad, y'all." Pat off it, Sarah.
That's pretty funny.
I started to be away from Amelia.
Yeah.
The cuteness is
Yeah.
what we needed. But y'all are totally adorable. It's fun to follow on this one.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Especially like in the early part when she wasn't sleeping that much. I definitely missed her, but there definitely was a little bit of like a debate tournament as sleep. But now she's like sleeping great, so I mean I like the debate tournament, but I miss the baby.
Yeah, for sure.
Wow. So that's a strong statement about early childhood is that the debate tournament's an escape for sleep. Like
That's
it's-
true.
That's saying something.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure every debate parent I know has mentioned that once or twice.
She had 4 months yesterday.
Hmm.
Went to the doctor.
Okay.
Healthy. 73rd
Alright.
percentile head circumference. Like, it's crazy. But yeah.
All the babies in my family are bald.
Really?
Hester, you can.
Yeah, I will.
I'm just emailing them, Hester.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, what?
I'm just emailing them.
Oh, awesome. Can you throw me on that?
Yeah.
If you're just responding to
You're
his, I'm
already-
Oh, you're already
yeah.
on the thing?
Nice.
Um,
Did you put me on?
No.
I'm kidding.
Well, you'll respond all to the email too.
Sorry if this is a little too much TMI, but during the actual birthing process, the doctor was like, "Hey, you can see the head," and I looked, and then I was like, "What the fuck was that?" Because there was just like all hair. I was like, "I don't know what I'm looking at. What is that?"
Remember when you said maybe this is TMI?
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. My bad. Really? I've never.
It's great to see an excited dad.
I've never been great with boundaries. I apologize.
The baby came out with a head full of hair.
Yeah, but
You don't get on your Facebook enough, and don't make him retell the story again.
I was going to comment that my sister was born with a head full of black hair, and then when she turned a year old, it all fell off. And then she came back blonde. Yeah.
Lisa?
Yeah, Lisa was born with black hair.
No, she was.
Yes, she was absolutely, and then it fell out and it came back blonde.
No.
Like, yeah, no explanation of why. We didn't like live near power lines or something. You know, there was no nuke power plant nearby or something. You know,
Hey, don't-
3-eyed
that's
fish or
you.
something.
So Chief Jackson Power.
Oh, accusing?
Yeah.
Oh.
Did you get
do you,
the
aren't they your
document from
competitor? Do you represent
Just
them?
got like a second.
What?
Don't
Okay.
you represent them too? Or you're not just Cole?
Yeah, that's kind of a struggle list for me. I'm trying to
Aren't they
say.
competitors?
Yeah, everything.
Oh,
Yeah,
They're
that's-
just sending us.
It's okay.
They've diversified their holdings.
I'm used to debating trade-offs there. I
That's
forgot that you could.
Yeah, that is a lot of stuff.
Spend a lot of time with
We're sorting out the email chain.
A lot. Do you mind if we just copied into it?
No, you. Okay. So
Her
usually-
document, her
Yeah, no.
computer freezes
We
if
got-
she saves documents.
Do you hate on natural gas?
Yeah, that sounds helpful.
It seems like
we represent
Debate.
Yeah. Because it seems like Cole and the nukes have to be kind of enemy, my enemy is my friend kind of thing with
Two
natural
emails.
gas, no?
One is a Word document with card.
producers, so whatever fuel they have to use, they have to use.
Yeah, aside
So,
Yes,
for
and then
utilities
the other one
themselves,
is
so.
the email I had with the card.
Maybe
Maybe
everyone
it's something also.
Oh,
So
sorry.
every 5 minutes we
Yeah,
applying
okay.
simultaneously.
They
You
just
don't have to say
sell
what you
electricity.
Trying to help you.
Yeah.
So, they don't like any, they're like any
Got it.
freedom's all they.
Got it.
Okay, so.
It isn't free.
The case
That's billable hours.
framework homogenization, okay? Which is the legalized sex work, and then the black matrix, okay?
That, yeah.
I'm sorry, what?
That was the second thing.
Yeah.
Case.
Case, framework,
Uh-huh.
homogenization with the legalized sex work, all,
Okay,
and then
sure, the
the black
prostitute, okay.
matrix.
And then the counter-hegemony.
Everybody good? Sounds good. We come from a time when black women slaves were raped by white masters for the purpose of breeding. The United States government failed to realize these women were human beings rather than workers that can manipulate for more efficient production. We come from a time when black girls thought white dolls were more nice looking than black ones. These black girls failed to notice their own beauty. We come from a time when black women not allowed to participate in beauty pageant. Now we still fail to realize what it means for a black woman to have a to take up space to be recognized for her actions on the role of the balance to challenge and confront respectability politics. You should prefer methodologies to liberate the prostitute. Any methodology to liberate the prostitutes. It leaves attacks of violence committed against the prostitute's body and leaves the norms of racial and social exclusion to demonize black women as dirty, dangerous, deviant. There are 3 impacts of the affirmative that neither can use to make labor, i.e. working for themselves, not working for the state. This is key distinction that I'll make in a second. The second is the question of erotic to you, because the Jane Mock quote, which indicates we need a space to create a space to understand how the messy, the erotic body is formulated in things like dance and erotic embodiment. And the last thing is the question of maroonage or community building. That's a piece of James Evans from the one he sees that we can exist on the boundaries of democracy through a process of resignification, defining ourselves in opposition to civil society, but rather creating ourselves as something new. The alternative self kids go to the framework to make first our counter interpretations legal. Legalization needs to social structure, practice, construction, norms, and values. So legalization is a norm of social development for at least two variants of legalization that differ in their conceptual understanding for rational statements, laws, and institutional forms. Conscious of this, constructive thinkers, laws, primarily possible legitimacy creation through normative consensus. Constructivists is creating an understanding of laws, a system of rules by promoting concept of legal law, having its roots in society rather than centralized lawmaking laws constituted by not by specific qualities of rules, but a particular style of arguing, a form of reasoning with the rules. Constructivists criticize the conception of legalization as falsely understanding the laws of artifact. This is important for their dialogue, which is about not reaching consensus, but having a conversation. Our interpretation of legalization is about neoliberalism has radically transformed the function of law. We're not the slaves, we're the new slave limiting state activity while organizing social order through governmentality, things like respectability, politics, government, global organized and ruling populations are subject to necropolitical discipline through the imperative order and imprisonment. These forces are defined through the racial extension and re-articulation. They become target states of exceptions, technology of population management, races mobilized inside and outside the community state, racialized implication are actively mobilized as a mode of securitization. The more robust of the neoliberalism, the more likely the race would be rendered largely immune from the state intervention. Neoliberalism is just a relation of the state to private spirit. It ensures that a space for extending socio-racial intervention is given a legal regime of equality before the law. The state can no longer be seen to engage in a license or racially discriminatory acts. Instead, the state reaches far more less curtail, making privatized racial expression mostly beyond state delimitation. The slogan of neoliberalism might well be the state looks after your interests by encouraging you to choose to lock yourself in, while it laughs at the undesirable traditional language of and objects of racial humiliation are not so much easily erased as structurally transformed. They are not silently reference those who threaten the social security of the nation. Our interpretations of here open a possibility for personal engagement with the resolution while still upholding the instrumental action, because respectability politics is a statute. Turner, I visit 92, the term resolved the first positive decision in relation to the personal meaning of events. We would resolve the individual emerge from the engagements with a new skill or process involved in the accumulation of skills for instrumental or emotional response. Vulnerability implies openness to both harm and enhancement. Now, per mutation, the affirmative is a topic version of prostitution reform at the state level must be part of a larger liberation movement that challenges the racialized and sexualized stereotype violence and Palestinian prostitution reform must be part of a broader liberation movement, shifting the framework of analysis toward the degeneracy, respectability by we current social relations give supporting groups in society each taking striving for respectability and build coalitions really have encounter resistance and frequently have failed. The realities of stereotypes of the loose black woman, the Jezebel so pervasive that black women who consider themselves respectable are especially likely to be inhibited from identifying with black prostitutes. Claim for respectability politics reinforces systematic and coalition building on these terms may have more potential than legal reform alone to transform the meaning of prostitution to benefit the lives of women in prostitution. Also, there's a more practice disadvantage there. Framework argument criminalizes us, especially the social order assumption that there's a neutral way to interpret the topic. Use some topical version of the act that will emerge in the block paints white supremacy. Also, stateless epistemology turns all of the dialogue arguments. Vote in 14. The regulation of statelessness, the primary and proper function of the state is that it's the interpretive work of the state apparatus precisely calling the citizen subject into being the regulated stateless flesh of the bone and the bones of the citizens that crack and crumble the parched atmosphere sovereignty, violent democracy, staunting. That is more crucial than ever. What means in the value in the African American thought and life is the example of the life in statelessness, not at all some supposed triumph and emergent of color, landmarks immeasurable, contours and calculable duration of a little thing, a will event which disrupts whatever dream sovereignty emerges. Blackness places a kind of pressure on identity. The identity cannot withstand that there is a deliberation semantics that turns all over their dialogue arguments. Collins in 2000, the United States, a scholar making a knowledge claim typically must convince a scholarly community controlled by the white avowedly heterosexual men holding useless so that the claim is justified when elite white men or any other overtly homogenous group dominates the knowledge validation process. Both of these political criteria can work to suppress black women's thoughts, giving the general use cultural shaping and taking for granted knowledge of the community of experts is permeated by widespread notions of black and female inferiority. New knowledge tends to see violence, fundamental subject are likely to be viewed as anomalies. Specialized thought challenging the notions of black female inferiority is unlikely to be generated from within the white male controlled academic settings, both because of the kinds of questions asked and the answers to the marketing answers to them. There's also a framework argument where turning your form of monology, your form of dialogism as far as Bakhtian dialogue is a high dialogue, me with a low dialogue. We don't have to have consensus, but we do have a researchable ground. You have ground. You could have a topic disadvantages about prostitution, things like the trafficking thing. Now go to the critique. The first critique, first permutation. You go permutation, you can affirm the prostitute and legalized sex work. We are impacting the link of black female bodies, the structuring precondition for the market of sex work. Collins and sexuality has importance of the modification of bodies. Sex work is in turn articulates with black agency responding to advanced capitalism. African Americans participate in the sex work industry not as commercial workers, but representations of commodified black sexuality, racialized images of pimps and prostitutes, maybe the commercial sex workers who who are most visible in the relations of production sex work encompasses a set of social practices, many of which may not immediately be recognized as sex work, as well as a constellation of representation that create demand for sexual services, attach value to services, identify sexual commodities with race, gender, and age-specific individuals, and rules that regulate this increasingly important consumer market class, race, ethnicity, and age and citizenship categories work to position women differently from within the global sex industry. Also, there's no way that the criticism is able to resolve the act, and there's also no point of mutual exclusivity. You can legalize sex work and still affirm the one you see. The piece of Sanders Day I read is the piece of evidence because it's consistent with exact evidence that we have to have particular context. There's also no link to this argument because either we are a counter-hegemonic epistemology, things like statelessness, or we're not a counter-hegemonic politics in the context of prostitution. We must focus on the complex ways in which sex and labor is exchanged, which is exactly what the 1EC does. There's also a double turn with their other position because focus on the black matrix is the internal link to focusing on how sexualized body and commodities were to go. The permutation will resolve all this, and the second piece of whiter evidence, which is their alternative evidence, is about polymorphism and how we understand the positionality, intersectionality of the 1EC and the historical material analysis, how the black matrix is situated, the libidinal linguistic material economy solves all this argument. There's not, the permutation can't overcome. Go to the second critique. The first of the critique is a pick out of the prostitution or the prostitutes infinitely regressive. There's no bright line of preventative sort of picks. It's also racial with the fabricates the notions of racial with the pickets and unconsensual relationship. The 1EC, the prostitute is in the position of structural reproductivity. This is important to focus on how intimate private sphere happens. There's a private sphere just to be an issue. This alternative because the James Evans says that you fold the black woman in when you focus on state-made violence rather than the intimate forms of violence that happen on the libidinal level and the material level. Now the pickets and material attempt to steal about our labor in this debate, which impact turns all of your works about all of your arguments about focusing on the value of labor and work. This means that we have a fluidity disadvantage to the critique because it perpetuates a false neutrality of whiteness. Also, permutation sex work reproduces the work society and perpetuates a system of white supremacy, patriarchy, and colonial violence. Only prostitution or understanding that prostitutes embody the experience is framing glasses to avoid being co-opted and get the demand that we get a fucking job weeks in 14. My interest was in theorizing the possibilities of politics of and against work that would appeal to a wide, potentially wide swath of employed, underemployed, employed, unemployed, precariously employed, and overworked. The majority of us who are not will serve by the work of society or its ethical support. The struggle to get a life beyond work must take place on many fronts. I want to return against the opposition I offer between work and life. The project creating a life beyond work requires that we come to terms with all of the ways of subjugation at work built on other processes of dehumanization, slavery, colonialism, white supremacies, and patriarchies are wellsprings from which work as a system of hierarchy can draw from. Me, your piece of first piece of evidence you wrote on this logic says only careful consideration of the culture and historical material ways in which we are situated, which means that we have an internal link to why we start from reproductivity. We also are answering your Scott evidence. Your Scott evidence is about the problem of colonialism. Makes an inseparable kind of a solution, but we don't say that the positionality of the black female is one of abjectness. We say that there is agency, but it's always commodified. We aren't creating ourselves in opposition to the state, but rather creating ourselves as something new. James entertain individualism is a false ideology. The rebel intellectual has family obligations and duties that extend to the masculine to die or death of the expense of kinship and determined by the willingness of its members to share the same body. The suffrage's vulnerabilities and the victories. It's a moving target of racist repression. One does not struggle to realize that the one will become like other natives. One struggles to accept that one is other natives. Neither education nor connections offer protection from violence and enslavement. Those natives who are told that they are better because they have proximity to colonizers, language, religion, education, wealth, and the political structure starting for a rude awakening, marketed awakening. There's also no chain of equivalency, even if there are other intersectional oppressions in ways that blackness is situated materially and linguistically. Doesn't mean that the act is wrong.
Can you send a marked version of that week's card?
Of weeks? I read the whole thing, but it's like not highlighted. It's underlined.
Oh,
It's missing some of the underline.
Sorry, it
we
was
just have the
underlined in our
box.
copy.
Yeah, we just have the
Email.
boxes.
I apologize.
What?
We just have the
No,
box.
okay, hold on.
the way that formatted into
Yeah,
the
in the
email.
email.
Oh, okay,
Did
my
that
bad, my
line,
bad.
so-
Okay, great. I was like, it's
You don't
definitely,
mind.
okay, give me a second.
Yeah, yeah.
These are weeks.
Yeah.
Weeks. Okay. I'm gonna save it in a Word document. Weeks. Yep. It's sent. Let me know when you get it. Sorry about that.
Yep, I think we're good. Okay, so your James evidence says, quote, the black matrix offers the foundational frame for building the border between democracy and captivity and deniability of state inmate violence. You then characterize the affirmative as building something new. Can that something new ever cross the border that your James evidence describes?
What? Yeah,
It can.
James is talking about maroonage, right? How democracy is possible, how contestation and ideas and dialogue is possible in a space of the beloved community. We see the internal link to that is checking respectability.
What
laws.
exactly is the status of the relationship between something old and something new?
I don't know what you mean.
Can they coexist?
I don't.
So you
I
say
don't
you create
understand.
something
You mean-
new outside of the current border of democracy that the black matrix
The
defines.
current
It's a
border of
foundational frame.
democracy makes it so that the current political ontology cannot come to terms with the position of black women. The 1AC thinks we break down the politics of respectability through creating new signs and symbols, new
Okay.
internal
What is the
signifiers
effect
that
of
allow us
breaking
to
down the
engage in the
politics of
current political.
respectability?
It's the ability to have dialogue, the ability to have contestation of
What's
ideas.
the effect
right?
on the border?
What do you mean?
What is the effect of breaking down
It challenges
respectability
how
politics
democracy
on the
operates,
border?
right? So the
Okay.
premise of dialogue, which is internal to democracy, right? We say it can't happen when you're too concerned about how short my skirt is, or whether or not I
And
have a
that
real
creates-
vagina, or
and that
what.
creates something new.
What?
What is the relationship
Yes.
of that something
So
new
we are indicting
to
democracy.
something
We're like,
old?
that's a false democracy. It is not real democracy.
Understood.
It creates democracy. Does that-
has positioned certain people in this way. You
I just think
reposition
that democracy
them.
is fundamentally
Is that
flawed.
repositioning always outside of democracy?
What?
You say you
So
reposition
democracy in the quo
Yes.
is flawed.
Yes.
We create a new democracy by challenging respectability politics.
Is
So we
that
can have
democracy always outside of the
No,
status quo?
look,
I don't know
the
what he's
status,
asking.
yeah, it's outside of this, yes.
I'm honestly
Currently, black women are segregated from politics because they have the inability to voice opinions because of politics respectability exists. The 1AC says that we can create new ways to create signs and symbols outside of the one given to us by civil society to engage with the current political
What is
paradigm.
the relationship of that with the libidinal economy of anti-black consumption as your
Oh my lord. Okay, so James says that blackness is consumed on three levels: libidinal, material, and linguistic. There's a material desire, a profitability about consuming and reproducing blackness.
Okay.
There is a rhetorical.
What does breaking down the politics of respectability do in the context of that libidinal economy?
Right. That's the thing.
Libidinal economy that hypersexualizes black women in the status quo. The 1AC says that that deviancy is only capable of being expressed and placed onto bodies because we can't refuse to internalize those tropes.
Right,
Because
so,
we believe we are the
for example, we have been positioned as the Jezebel, and the internalization of that Jezebel work mean we act it out in our own communities, right? We do the work of civil society, right? We police each other based on those paradigms.
Okay.
That's the internal
So
to challenging the libidinal.
the something outside is no longer the work of civil society, am I
What?
correct? in
Yes,
saying
we're
that?
not working for civil society. We ain't working for the state. I don't know how to put this any simpler. I'm getting
A
confused.
counter-hegemonic struggle, to be clear, just means that you have to break down the existing hegemony. That's
Yeah.
like the literal.
I don't know where the offense was. I didn't find it.
Okay.
You should.
Was there like a firm text I could ask for the counter-hegemony? I had you saying permutation and using the weak sentence. Is there like a, is it just like something
This is the non-homogenization.
the counter-hegemony can?
Yeah, it's a permutation you go. Permutation you can from the class to the hegemonic trouble. So if you get the most pointedly but exclusively, that's how we'll articulate it.
Thank you. Debate ought to have substantive procedural constraints in order to have meaningful engagement between both sides. The topic provides a mechanism for those discussions that we have to be productive. They turn the activity into a self-serving, uncontestable, fatalistic monologue. Sometimes it's good for people to defend things that they don't believe. We have three impacts this argument. First, the structural side bias and nuances debating this is not a stock fairness argument, so a majority of the criticisms are applied. Lack of stable advocacy, which their solvency mechanism of the and explanatory tool of the body is located means the applicant can change the starting points of the debate. They can recharacterize their advocacy to shift around links to avoid clashing with their arguments in favor of unfounded no-link argument. The one made arguments about the black matrix which exists to produce the fungible bodies were a pig out of saying that it is true that fungibility exists in the stats of the black matrix. They narrow the debate in terms of most favorable for them. This is an impact in and of itself. Debate is a competitive activity which requires some procedural fairness to do its game interest nature, but also turns the case it shapes our research practices as a community, encourages debaters and coaches to debate in nuance and rush to equally extremist discrimination of the world because they compete with everything. And the fact that you can always read the cap, K, or anthro against every affirmative demonstrate that they ignore debate over the nuance of position. Substantive regulations demarcate limits are necessary for dialogue. Refusal to tailor identity claims to a normative public stance shuts out the possibility for discussion to happen in the first place. For it to be quite clear, we don't need to win any of our politics or state good arguments to win this internally. It's about argument testing. The differences between advocacy under their interpretation becomes only time constraints, which means the negative is structurally unprepared. This makes debate made meaningless because there are always constraints on preparation. They will say that they've been reading this affirmative or the wiki solve that does not develop advocacy in a way that deep contestation over a point of stasis. There's always some spin that's fundamentally unpredictable. Second is mechanism debates. We can win this argument even if the state is not going to be of uniqueness for our argument that academic spaces are saturated with critique in the status quo, which means that policy may not always be the best tactic, but pragmatism and specific material practice is necessary. Topical version of the affirmative is to affirm legalization of prostitution. The defense of this will mostly be in the 1 hour, but I'll do a little bit of the work here. The topical version is not perfect, but those imperfections are called negative ground debate. It's supposed to be a training error. We'll concede that argument from the last piece of Collins evidence that they've read and the Turner evidence that they've read, which means that we control an effective and larger internal link. If they make debate net worse, then we obviously control the internal link turn to a majority of their offense. And before they can win any of their case impacts, they have to win that the affirmative is something that is predictable and we can have nuance debate over, which means that we internally turn a majority of their offense in a prerequisite. The counter-interpretation debate, their evidence describes different mechanisms for legalization. It says one mechanism is to define legalization in the context of the law, the other is to constitutive agency and legalization in the context of prostitution. So it means that it's regulations specific to the act of prostitution. Even if they're right that constructivism creates a law, does not mean that you can have prostitution without regulation. The impact is predictability, procedural constraints on substance are necessary. It's impossible to keep up with the number of the way that the constructivist approach to law can relate to the topic. We can never do quality research on the topic because we're left researching literally every way they can approach different problems like after rejecting the topic, affirming the topic entirely, like weaker states die-side after and what use suicide bomber after reject the state entirely, like Obama's resistance to anti-blackness over both use anarchy after that reframe our understanding of the a topic era like Baylor's PASF or USC's prostitution after focus on autobiography like Michigan's affirmation of queer death after focus on accessibility like race fugitivity. All of these things demonstrate that counter-interpretations are not neutral. They justify reading any interpretation of the topic that makes debate most favorable for them. Remember that predictability operates on a sliding scale. The more we make debate unpredictable for us, the more we make debate predictable for the affirmative. All of these demonstrate that approaches to debate are no longer constrained by the best arguments with the greatest academic merit, but positions that are vague and not tied to advocacy. They're built to avoid link. Our counter-interpretation provides a meaningful way to engage the nuance of advocacy, which internally turns a majority of their offense. There's no way they can meet because the plan says the legalization of the prostitute, which is decriminalization. Jacobson and 40 many supporters of decriminalization of the prostitution for Sweden for its partial decriminalization model. The teacher of Sweden, partial decriminalization model that recognizes prostitution as a form of violence against women. Sweden places emphasis on protecting the buyers, extending help to the prostitutes who want to get out of the sex industry. The system of partial decriminalization laws do not penalize those who sell sex. This is distinguished from total decriminalization because the government can still punish buyers or other third-party exploiters. Their Goldberg evidence is not possible to make this argument with the other cards they have about creating coalitions with the state. Their argument is our argument is that it's not ontological. This is proven by all of their no-link arguments. It's true that neoliberalism may constitute a racial formation, but that's a status quo. It's obviously not essential. The act results in melancholy. The attempt to look at the past for an understanding of the current political failures can never hope for a political change. It depoliticizes the mechanism of the affirmative. They're too obsessed with re-articulation of the past, never understand the possibilities for change. The future antagonisms are true of all places, but people have differing ideological sets, which means that even if things are similar, they're not the same. Things change throughout history. Civil rights movement, prison reforms against the welfare state, counter-hegemony proves that consensus and decensus is possible. You should vote negative to understand that progress is not the only articulation of social life. We can acknowledge that they're different without acknowledging that things are necessarily better. They're like the Borg in Star Trek, a hive mind that assimilates all. There's no way that resistance happens under their interpretation. The revolution, good or necessary arguments also prove our link arguments. The Rockefeller laws in response to deindustrialization led black middle class to push powerful laws against pushers to distance themselves from being associated with economic declassifications. Understands the understanding of the racial formation of the black matrix means that those formations that are instituted by individuals within that subject position are fundamentally ignored because they erase the politics that classifies upon race, presuming that race is politics. Or Scott evidence indicates that even revolution is inherently liberal. The narrative of revolution is even impossible to separate from things like the notions of sovereignty, progress, and reason, which means that there's no ability for them to separate. Their Turner evidence says that resolve is about building a set of skills. We'll concede that argument that the only data will allow us to build that set of skills that's necessary. The idea idea that the only productive politics, the possibilities politics of respectability, fundamentally bankrupt. A lot of this will be in the case of the wonder, but I'll make a few arguments. Topicality is not a call for complete respect. Embracing abjectness and ugliness can occur within engagement over the question of legalization, even if regulations are bad for prostitution. There's ability to defend things like PAS with the criticism of respectability. Regulations are vital to negative ground, even if it means your act isn't perfect. You should be asking, why are you searching for the act to be perfect? There's no reason for that. Respect for argument constraint is not the same thing as respect for sexuality. The criticism of sexual respectability is not intrinsic to the criticism of the topic, and metaphors of comparing modes of thinking are useless. Class 13. There's no point in comparing traumas in the sense of equating them as traumas. Noble experiences escape the logic of the metaphor. Differing experiences can only be linked together in the productive manner. As one is prepared to abandon the metaphorical modes of thinking, which can erase differences. Metaphors and texts always involve violence, and that they allied the distinct experience of metanomical linkings. The counteract the violence, enabling less appropriative encounters multiple histories of suffering and address one another without collapsing one into another trauma. May provide the link between cultures and offers a reflection on how such connections or visions of cross-cultural solidarity. They say respectability is a regulation. Yes, this can be a social regulation, but it does not mean that it's a regulation unique to prostitution, which is our interpretation. Decriminalization is the imposition of all regulations that apply to every other form of work. Legalization is a unique form of regulations like licensing mechanisms and health regulations. They say permutation with their bellows evidence of permutation makes no sense. Winning the state is good. It's not relevant to our topicality arguments about proceduralism and predictability. What are they permuting? The moral panic to decide the topic, you're correct, is not always neutral in its effect, but does not mean that there is not a way for us to come up with consensus for a starting point from which conversation can then lead to dissensus. They have already agreed on some procedural constraints of fairness, the degree of speech or the speech times being F, and you're on the left side of the pairing, respecting the balance system, etc., which means that the arbitrary difference about rejecting the topical constraints or a link to our offense, meaning procedural constraint on content in order to have productive debates that get to the heart of the matter and agree upon a degree of nuance. The act paramount the debate in a way that is contestable only for them. The deliberation dissent doesn't apply. Topicality doesn't enforce homogenizations. Having differing relationships to the state does not say that we're all equally related to neoliberalism. I.e., liberalism can affect us in different ways. We can have differing states of dependence upon the state or relationships to the state, but does not mean institutional engagement is bankrupt. Move in 13. Institutional attachments as deemed as obstacles has been the one. Is deemed as obstacles to absolute democracy and imminent critique of institutions. We're transforming them into a terrain of contestation. The possibility of counter-hegemony struggle to disarticulate neoliberal hegemony. What is rejected assertion and applies political practice can only have efficacy outside institutions. And perspective is profoundly mistaken and disempowering because it impedes us from recognizing the multiplicity of avenues for engagement. To believe that existing institutions cannot become the terrain of contestation is to ignore the tensions that exist within a given configuration. And the possibility of subverting their articulation is through the multiplicity of discursive practices that our world is constructed. The social is a sedimented political practice that conceal the originary acts of contingent institution. Every order is the expression of political power, particular power relations. What is given in the moment is accepted as natural. It's the result of hegemonic practices. The things could always have been otherwise, and every order is predicated on the exclusion of the possibility of counter-hegemonic practice disarticulated to establish a different hegemony. This strategy is composed of a diversity of practices operating in multiplicity of spaces: economic, legal, political, cultural. Culture is where the common sense is constructed to maintain hegemony. The system is to permanently mobilize people's desires and shape identities in a cultural terrain. Occupies a key position in the process of commodification to challenge the system. Counter-hegemonic politics was engaged with this terrain and target the identification of provides a condition for post-forward capitalism. Critical practice do not contribute to the struggle by deserting, but by engaging with the aim of fostering dissensus in the multiplicity of agonistic spaces where dominant contestants is challenged and where new modes of identification are made available. They say that we made arguments and so we have ground. Yes, we've made arguments, but maybe they've been specific, but it's not predictable ground. It would be necessary to have a test of their ideology. If it's not predictably affirmative, we'll always have an upper hand by doing more research on something. Plus, they can take the moral high ground. Their position that's contestability depends on us winning their individual spin as opposed to engagement with the institution having. We have uniqueness for our impact that was explained above. The ground argument that we could read trafficking DA wouldn't apply because you only legalize the prostitute, which is different from the act of prostitution, which involves solicitation of sexual acts. And even if we did read the trafficking DA, there's obviously a fundamental position that we're not allowed to have uniqueness for those DAs because we can't have counterplans that compete with the mechanism of the affirmative, which means that those DAs are not relevant. Even if we win one trafficking DA, it's not a question of the nuance of the debate of the affirmative, which is uniquely necessary. Reading Topicality does not force an engagement over extremist positions or exclude individuals.
Okay, let's talk about the bottom part of this, the ground arguments. Why doesn't a supply and demand link argument for a trafficking DA, why does that not link to the act? If more black women are selling ass post the 1AC, why does that not lead to
Legalize
trafficking?
the prostitute. That's
If
like
more
the
black
solution.
women are selling pussy
I'm
post
saying
the
that-
1AC,
I'm
why
saying
is that not a
preserving that one link argument is terrible negative.
So you can read the trafficking DA. Let's talk
You're
about
right, you
Palermo.
can
Why
read
can't you read a
any
Palermo
trafficking
DA
DA.
with a perception link?
Palermo DA is terrible, but it's not.
You don't like the Palermo DA? Okay, so
Palermo-
come on now.
the Palermo
DA
the
is
Swedish model is
stop. Okay,
consistent
so
with
I
Palermo.
have a question then. So
There's
what
no link to
disadvantages?
There's no link to the
what,
Palermo.
I disagree. People
But
hate us on this.
you don't
I have
legalize
a
the
question.
buying
Legalize
of
the buying
sex,
of
which
sex.
is the
No,
purpose of
it's
the
a.
Palermo
I said
doctrine.
perception. I said perception.
Yes, the
link.
perception
So I have
link.
another
It's
perception.
the
I have another
perception
question.
link.
Okay, I have another question. So what are the exact arguments that you are upset that you didn't get?
It's about predictability, right? So
any
So
argument
topic
about
DAs.
research depends
So your argument
on
is that you can
topic
never.
DAs.
So I have a question. So your argument.
You're not even letting me answer a question.
No, because
Yeah.
I have another question. Your argument is that topic DAs are not predictable ground. or that
Topic
you couldn't
DAs
get
depend
topic
upon
DAs?
a difference between decriminalization and legalization of applying specific regulations to the act of
So
prostitution.
to win this argument, so I understand, for trafficking and Palermo, you have to win that there's a difference between legalization and decriminalization that precedes your ability to read those. So there are no link arguments that you can make those DAs.
There are, but there's no uniqueness without those counterplans.
No, I'm not talking about counterplans. I'm talking about those DAs.
I'm saying the debate over prostitution is not prostitution
So,
good bad.
so your concern
it's
is about
models
so
of
your concern now is
prostitution
about process
legalization.
counterplans.
They're not process counterplans like the commission's counterplan.
so-
It's over decriminalization, the Swedish model, and legalization.
So I
You're
have,
correct.
I guess I have
If
another
those are process
question. I have
counterplans,
another
then
question
I'm
about the
good with
Mufi
that.
evidence. The Mufi evidence is about how counter-hegemonic politics cannot challenge neoliberal governmentality.
Can.
Okay, so what does it mean to be counter-hegemonic?
In this sense, it means to, that'll probably be a lot more in the 1 hour, but.
I'm sure it will be, but explain now. 'cause
So
you read
it
in the
means to have a crossing between linkages, or I guess like the way that Jason explained it was, Jason?
Sorry. I
Jason,
wasn't listening.
somebody want to help me? Because I'm confused.
I
What does it
wasn't
mean to be
listening to the question.
counter-hegemonic? Okay.
Counter-hegemonic relies upon building chains of equivalences between different groups.
Okay. So it relies upon making analogies to the black matrix and other peoples.
Not
No,
necessarily
not
to the black
analogies.
matrix.
What
Analogies are
what
not
other
the
groups?
Also not to the
What
black matrix.
what are the groups of chains of equivalence?
So
that we should
the
engage
MOVE
in?
evidence makes
What
the
are the
argument that.
no, I read the MOVE evidence. I'm asking Jason. What are the chains of equivalence we should engage in?
He read the
I'm
move card.
confused.
The move card answers your question.
Yeah.
He's the one who
Well,
read it.
let
So
me
I
explain.
think he's
So,
the one who answered the
what are the
question.
chains of
Hegemony
equivalence?
exists in cultural, legal, economic senses. The plan addresses only things through the cultural sense. We think that you need to challenge.
So when we
legal
talk about
and
libidinal,
economic.
material, and linguistic violence, that's not the
That is part-
that's not the economic and the legal.
That is
But you
part of
understand
culture.
those as
You
only
understand- yeah,
structured
exactly.
only by culture. Which was
That's-
the top card you read on the
Materiality,
NDT
things we
violation.
don't have things. Okay.
I already
Okay.
sent out the one card that we're probably not going to read.
Okay, well, there
It's
you
going to
go.
be the prostitute K, then the counter-hegemony K.
Sorry, Jason, which did you say was first?
The prostitute.
Thank you.
Okay, the counter-hegemony.
I'll take it. I'm fine, alright.
No, so that's not even a second.
Oh, wait, so you are taking preference?
No,
Everybody read a topic
I
evidence.
was like, he was.
Thoroughly
Stop
confused.
talking.
My bad. Alright.
Everyone's confused.
I know. Okay, alright.
Prostitute K not going for permutation justice has a competition. There countless evidence that was a very good link to the other criticism. It says that the black female body is always already the structuring precondition for what other prostitutes has. This is a paradigmatic understanding of what sex work is. It's always being defined in relation to what black women is defined by civil society. However, you should understand prostitution not just as a monolithic entity, but rather as taking on different articulations within times and places. Only this understanding of it having a contingent relationship to civil society would build effective counter-hegemonic struggles, which is why they can't permute the other strategy, counter-hegemony K. Cross-sex shows their understanding of the black matrix is one where women reproduce fungible bodies for the consumption by civil society. This understanding places the slave, the black woman, as the necessary underside of civil society. Their attempt to create something new outside of civil society is premised upon a static notion of this something old. Civil society is not one thing. The status of black women and the slave within civil society has never been a monolithic position. Their articulation of civil society creates a unidirectional understanding of power. The slave and black women were always fungible bodies for consumption. This elicits the history of slave resistance, i.e. the Haitian rebellion, as well as all modern forms of resistance. Race is real in its effects, but it's not just the product of civil society's label. Rather, it's co-produced both by domination and resistance. Their understanding of anti-blackness as domination erases the role of black folks in the history of racial production. They will say they are not a traditional understanding of anti-blackness. We agree with a central tenet still remains that civil society can only ever understand black women as the prostitute as a tool for reproduction, and obviates the role of counter-hegemonic forces for re-articulating new roles and identities within civil society, i.e. not creating something new, but re-articulating the old. This calcifies resistance. Their understanding of black life life is one where they are passive victims being trodden on by majorities, marking them as abject life as the fungible body diffuse. Whiteness is the Borg in Star Trek. Resistance is futile, so we must carve out spaces for survival, which, as their James evidence clarifies this, on the border of democracy. But this politics locks resistance into certain times and spaces and cedes the future solely to action of white elites. We don't have to win a progressive view of history to win this debate, only that the future can be different, that marking can be linked to hegemonic intimidation. This recognition is a prerequisite to effective anti-subordination politics, because the affirmative just lapses into abject pessimism. That's our only and when is evidence a conceded alternative solvency. Counter-hegemonic forces can link together to define sex as work and rid hegemonic understandings of prostitutes and black women as always hypersexualized. You can also create space for eroticism. Our grant evidence says you can not just pursue an individual strategy for self-understanding. I view solely within the terrain of the cultural, which all of your answers to topicality say that the cultural must necessarily precede the legal. Rather, they should be understood as co-determinative of one another. Rather, almost target the law and culture. Get rid of criminality to open up space for movements to coalesce and focus on broader forces that criminalize the prostitute. Because if you are criminalized, just affirming yourself as a legal prostitute, affirming yourself as a legal black woman, does nothing to stop the police from chasing you, which is why targeting the law is necessary. A couple of 1AC quotes are going to be really demonstrative of this. First, their tag says, "No black women, no slave, and no world." This understands the current world as always being based upon the consumption of black women and slaves. However, we say that this world is not just a singular one, rather it is plural. Their James evidence says the black matrix offers the foundational frame for building the border between democracy and captivity and deniability of state inmate violence. We can re-articulate what violence matters, which is why we answer their argument about why we solely understand violence as being public, not private. We can have a re-articulated strategy, chains of equivalence to understand sex as work and understand the violence that occurs in the workplace, which is necessarily private. They say that the black vagina laid the chattel slave, which is always a product of consumption. I've answered that above. There are 2AC James evidence says, quote, "One struggles to accept that one is other natives. Neither education nor wealth nor connections offer them protection from the violence of colonization or enslavement." This understands colonization is always dominating regardless of your status within the world that you exist in. This obviates the role of space and time as influencing who you are and how you exist within the world, because no education, no wealth can change that. This situates them as a unitary status within civil society, or rather, we should be able to re-articulate that status. You should view this counter method as a pick out of the black matrix. We can agree respectability politics are bad, but disagree with their usage of the black matrix. Now, picks that as kind of the only thing they can win on. One, they're good. It's necessary to test all aspects of the affirmative, or else we're literally just given concessionary negative ground, like forcing you to say prostitution is bad or the trafficking DA, but this is always concessionary. You can build your affirmative around a critique of the trafficking DA. The literature is highly biased. We read a prostitution on the affirmative. I know the trafficking DA is really bad. We get counter-emphases that are textually and functionally competitive because it shows affirmative offense against it. It's not stealing your labor, because we obviously disagree with large swaths of what you're saying by saying that if we agree with you in one instance, it steals your labor. It teaches people to never actually agree, only to disagree, which is not how the politics actually works. It's also another link to the counter-hegemony case, because if you can never agree with someone without quote-unquote stealing their labor, then how are chains of equivalence supposed to be able to develop? Now, the permutation, I mean, most of the link arguments apply because it still includes the entirety of the 1AC, or else it's severance, so we can never get any form of negative ground. They don't get a permutation. Only fiat and action creates an opportunity cost. Analysis debate about method means the affirmative should be required only to defend the one presented in the 1AC. They cannot be combined without fundamentally altering each other. We presented reasons why the inclusion of their method wrecks the ability of counter-hegemonic struggles to have a coherent understanding of the world. Now, their sex has worked. Bad evidence. This week's evidence is god awful. It says that slavery, colonialism, white supremacies, and patriarchy are wellsprings from which work is a system of hierarchy can draw. But this understands work as being solely defined by oppression. Rather, we have a counter understanding of work, and we can re-articulate it away from the violence that currently exists in the workplace of prostitution, because it only understands it as oppression, never as agency. Then you can do things like labor laws, ensure things like minimum wage, which necessarily change the status of the prostitute. Our research evidence says if you understand the prostitute as solely the side of subjugation, you literally ignore the multiple statuses of the multiple stati of prostitute that exists across times and places. Their exact evidence is a solvency argument for our pick, because it says sex work is not a singular identity, rather it's a category of labor to be articulated in many different ways, which is why only the alternative can address the subjugation of the prostitute that exists in the status quo.
Five, 4, 6.
So then the doctor handed me the scissors and I had to cut the umbilical.
That part is actually
So I can get over it.
then.
I have no doubt you can continue to re-release.
He's a beautiful guy. Okay.
Cute and sweet.
Greta would not let me play Journey on the hospital room sound system while the bird was at, which I thought was really rude.
Yeah, that's rude.
I just assumed that's, you know,
Standard procedure, yeah.
Don't Stop Believing would be going around.
What were you gonna roll with?
Don't Stop Believing.
Oh.
But, you know,
Little Paul Anka, she's having my baby, how about that?
yeah, too little.
Nice,
Yeah.
nice.
Too little, okay, yeah, look at you.
Also, I mean, I'm pretty sure that I can't go
Yeah.
Kid does it better.
I'll let Maury know.
Have you, did you see the video of the monkey playing with the puppies?
Oh, yeah.
It's amazing. It's so good. Somebody posted it on Facebook. The monkey's like really nicely petting just like a pile of puppies.
Monkeys do love puppies.
Did you find it?
Puppies equal OMG. I'm assuming that's what the numbers are.
Right.
Oh yeah, petting a pile of puppies. That's exactly what this looks like.
Like he's being really nice about it.
God, you're so cute. Oh, he's like this.
He's a good monkey.
Is a good monkey. That puppy wanted pets too.
Trying to give, trying to get everybody some pets in.
Yeah, but this little one needs pets.
Yeah. Do you watch John Oliver? The when he was talking about net neutrality, and he showed the cat video. It's gonna push it up and then that one really kills me.
What internet are you on?
I went through the thing.
Okay, Danielle sent an email about.
I saw that. And yeah, I've already taken care of it. So.
Fair enough.
That just reminded me that I was annoyed.
$135.
What is it?
135.
You just said weird.
I need to watch Sad Cat Diaries again. It's just the best shit ever.
Isn't it?
Get water bottle in a second.
You better run.
We won't have a good excuse for using the bathroom for the 2 hour if you haven't drank some water now.
Fair enough, fair enough.
I just drank that water.
That's great.
We're sitting here this whole time.
Sound like kids are like really obviously just like slamming like a bunch of laxative or something. They're like,
Is there anything?
as you saw,
Yeah.
I'm gonna need quite a bit of prep time. Or sorry, bathroom time
Yeah.
before this 2 and 9.
Sorry.
But you saw me do it. You didn't stop me.
No. You had your chance.
Nice. Everyone on the live stream heard us talking about puppies and monkeys.
Oh, nice. You got any pets?
Yeah, 2 cats, a couple of guinea pigs, had a dog until recently, little lizards. My son gets whatever the hell he wants. Chaos.
Imagine you like walking in the door. Lizard.
Nah, it's exactly the sort of chaos I deserve.
All right.
Yay!
It'll be case, the critique, and then framework.
The case. The prostitute.
And I'm
Case. Teeth.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Extend a role about it, vessel birds, prostitute weeds, good theory, conceded advantage, they don't come to terms with first with materiality, gang evidence as a black woman can maneuver the illicit erotic economy to create material gain. Second is pleasure with pleasure component, affirmative says pleasure is denied black women in the status quo, and we can bring new sense and settles to fury and meeting. And 3, our community. James evidence says that once black women do this, we can propagate community outside of the borders of democracy, re-implicate the way that politics is in the status quo. The politics respectability makes it impossible for us to engage in the public sphere. The one you see disarticulates, which means we have an internal link to dissent in the way that we could ever engage in forms of public deliberation. Go into the critique proper pigs that represent the ideology of whiteness for excellence, and feminism, body politics from the framework collective. The ability to whiteness is fluid into ability to tactile politics without political spaces, avoiding vulnerabilities of being black. The pig avoids dampness to violence and race and lived condition for the revolutionary suffix and the advocacy statement of the one you see that are Julie and I from the prostitute. Our argument is that saying we agree with all your politics except for XYZ has historically been a common tragedy of liberal democratic activists that demands of revolutionary potential and we co-opted by larger democratic colleges that don't acknowledge black demands. All of their perf arguments are proven by reading the movie evidence that says we can't have counter-hegemonic struggles, and the piece of and the one in the evidence that says we have to have counter-hegemonic struggles. Our argument is that all of these show that not only that your public deliberation makes public deliberation, it also makes engagement impossible because it occurs under the fluidity of whiteness, where they're always able to goalpost and change the stasis point fraction, which not only makes you unpredictable, also means we have an internal link to the way that you engage in conversation. Counter-hegemony means that we have to escape the existing hegemony as it exists in the status quo. That's definitely not mutually exclusive with the affirmative. We don't reduce it to a chain of equivalences. The Collins evidence indicates that black women have been marked into zones of deviancy, and that deviancy is applied to other women in the way that we engage in sexuality and sexual practices. That's definitely not reducing their positions. It's a structural, the black matrix is a structural explanation of how the status quo maintains itself. All of the examples they give, Jim Crow to the prison industrial complex, all of those things still rely on black bodies existing. I don't think that uniqueness for your offense. We've read uniqueness that the only way to change that is the illicit erotic economy that you haven't answered. Yes, violence is contingent. We think the only contingent way to change politics is via the black matrix and allowing for black women to create new signs and symbols outside of the way they exist in civil society and the status quo. We don't see ourselves as abject systems. We think that we can create new signs and symbols. I'm going to finish with James right here. The new rebel being the black secular individual collective of rebelling, the line has become mechanized and rebelling within the spirit of freedom, driving a biological mechanical mind. This one to struggle for realization of the cyber closest possibilities, permanent revolution, convergence, consent, and the blood and the rational choice shaped by the imagination, memory, longing, evolution, one being born as mass unified, its own biological, mechanical, divine formation, revolution, part the end of time and space, conventionally understood what happens to the human becomes the writer, machine of the divine, the distinction not at the end of the world, but the end of humanity, blackness, no longer negation, white supremacy, many for something longer, subhuman or flight from human, without saying a disarticulation of blackness, think what that means. There's no textures, means that Miley Cyrus and I definitely have a different relationship to labor and labor relations. We need to understand why Miley Cyrus gains money from tricking on black women. Perm to F is not mutually exclusive with the parts of the, and it's not severance extent that there are other ways to test the affirmative. Go on to framework. Extend our interpretation, legalization, social discoursive practice, they mean what the affirmative is, but not government institutions. No reason why the beloved community isn't an institution that engages current political paradigms. They said regulations be removed. The regulation apply respectability politics. We have a station point for offense advocacy in our interpretations. That's reasonable limits on the topic legalization process, which can include decriminalization, which means at best we remove the legal restrictions on prostitution. That's NDT 14. Legalization, removing legal prohibition against something is not sure currently legal. Legalization is a process they've conceded. The disembodied politics is that forcing people to leave their social occasions, engage in distraction with people who oppress, means that we credit discussions, people who are being oppressed never confront the realities of anti-black violence. They've also conceded that moral panic to set negative participants in civil society, hypnotize and demonize black females and engaging in spaces they create moral panic by framing black women as parasitic to the activity and threatening to collapse. Stateless said they've conceded no evidence that black people have no special relationship to natal alienation, which means black people have lived outside the state. We have internally condemned the statelessness nature of black persons makes citizenry impossible to not only internally solve their public deliberation arguments, because we are already winning uniqueness that public deliberation is impossible without black women's voices being included. Their argument about dissent means that contestation is important. We have internally to contestation. They conceded that switch act doesn't solve the after Topicality plans mean that the negative doesn't have to switch act because everyone just searches for the best often. Not to mention that people read the treaties, affirmative read the treaties to set up on the negative top test switch act doesn't exist for policy or critique debaters. They say predictability. Blackness can't be predictable. The fact that civil society scripts blackness means our skin is containers for dearness, dangerous, and criminality. They inevitably willing and unwilling to their limits. Yes, we don't make it impossible for a direction. The resolution conceded the topic just as highlighted in the 2AC arguments. Still read arguments against us. Those arguments still go to our arguments. The topical version of the app links to their links to the myth and talk policing to that and the differences between the prostitute body and prostitution as per usual. They make us culpable for what the fuck Bosu does. Not sorry. We don't give a fuck. Our argument is that our interpretation of the resolutions that's reasonable standards. You get the CAPK, you get the plurima dissent, supply and demand sheets. Not our problem that you didn't find a good link. You haven't won that the heart of the topic should be the educational ground gain from the reading the fucking plurima dissent. But we've won that your interpretation excludes the affirmative that we have advantages to.
Give me just a second. 6:08. No, I have not. I have tickets to NDT and a bunch of folks.
These were the people that come out one day.
I'll go out. Okay, when is it?
May 14th, and Jerry Weather, that's one, if there's a show, Jerry Weather there, that, you or anyone needs a place. That wants to go.
Can I get the links to that?
Yeah, of course.
super cool.
Emory seems real nice.
They
yeah.
rolled through the Bay Area a couple months ago.
She seems real laid back, and seems very happy. And
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's all I really care about, I guess. I don't even really care that much. It's his year's life if he wants to be unhappy.
Yeah, he's cool dude.
No, he's been from probably the alumni statement most of the time. With all the Katie. Because Drew's gone quiet. Eber pops his head up every now and then. He rolls through DC. We grab a drink. He's gonna make a good grumpy old man alone.
Yeah.
No one will ever satisfy his exacting standards.
Anybody wants a cookie? Got a salty caramel.
Oh shit, you said salty
Yeah,
caramel.
exactly.
Like a dark inside.
Oh.
That's legit.
Okay.
They're not just for breakfast anymore.
What's up?
What year are these?
You're a sophomore.
Okay.
For generic like Hy-Vee cookie.
Exactly, I was gonna say
It's
that.
pretty bomb.
That does its work.
No. Just playing met the need. Turn around along the way, I lost a red pen.
That's why you have the hot spots.
Yep. Oh yeah, I've got some wheat thins in here. I've got a different type of cookie, just like traditional stuff, something.
Yeah, the one I found still has the oil and Paramount sticker on it from when I was in Madison's lab.
Wow.
Yeah.
What was he like as a lab leader?
Is the mic on? Suffice it to say that one day he did a practice debate all himself, all his speeches. And he was dressed fully as Raggedy Andy, makeup and everything. And it was, I learned more than about the world really. But he was an incredible lab leader, actually.
Wow.
We can continue this conversation, and we should.
Yeah, I went from him to then
Ladies can do this stuff. You interrupted us.
What's that? Who's the leader?
Hal Chesapeake was found next year.
That's awesome.
Teeth and the
Salty caramel.
I was reading the comments.
We provide a competing method for evaluating the efficacy of political performance. They need to win a complete and totalizing rejection of all use of the federal government, the states, or the process of legalization. This should be fundamentally impossible, since the very fact that we're having this debate proves that there is some foundational essentialism in the absent answers to topicality. They do have an answer. There's obviously some value in defending some of those positions. Any risk of that means that you should vote negative. They have to win the politics that starts with the black matrix is essentially opposed with starting with a discussion about regulated prostitution. If they win, then if they don't, then there's no reason to vote affirmative. We're going for one impact nuance. Debating this outweighs the case. We will concede that debate is a training ground for development of skills. That's in their turn evidence. But the question should be what type of education may inculcate ideological extremism, denies the complexity for argument that's necessary for good discussion to happen. Their argument about the treaties that actually proves our argument that link debate is actually a really good nuanced debate over whether the marijuana legalization breaks the treaty or not. But the plan obviates those things by saying that it's just the treaties, DA. Yes, we have one demand linked to the trafficking DA and a perception linked to the preliminary DA. The debate about prostitution is not about the demand link. It's about Decron versus legalization versus Sweden Swedish model. They obviate the debate in favor of affirm the prostitute, which they've conceded is the Swedish model, which is decriminalization. What is our net ground there? Are we supposed to be prepared to debate every model of decriminalizing prostitution? What is the uniqueness for our trafficking? Our strategy against prostitution is based on differing methods of criminalization. That is the debate. The app provides a negative with generic ground to contest their advocacy. It's not predictable ground, even if it is some ground, which is necessary to test their ideology. The problem is that their solvency mechanism and the framing for the 1AC is not related to the legalization of the prostitute, which is the fundamental unpredictability of the affirmative. It's not predictable. The affirmative will always have the upper hand by doing more research on the subject, plus they can always take the moral high ground, or a position that's contestability depends on contesting individual spin as opposed to institutional engagement. That is our nuance. In fact, we have uniqueness for our impact that they conceded that the political is saturated with critique in the status quo, which means that only pragmatism has a hope of solving the community's research practices are shaped by extremism, because things that clash with everything like cat and anthro are popular because they provide easy debate for the negative. We are internally turning all of their liberation discussion arguments because extremism means that the best method for debate and discussion only exists via nuance debating, and the topic that hedges back against all of their anti-blackness is true, or we can never engage with institutions argument because you cannot know that without testing rigorously the affirmative. The only way that you can provide that test is with regulation of prostitution and the topic in the first place, topical version, substantive service, substantial mitigation. Even if we don't win that there's an exact version of the app, why should that matter? It provides substantial defense against their arguments. You are correct. It's not possible to be perfect, but that is negative ground. There are huge disadds to the topical version of the app, but that is a reason why the reason why debate is preserved. Our OB and why not evidence, our grant evidence is that the approach to prostitution that is around gaining individual identities and only affirming the solidarity of prostitution homogenizes the act itself. Anti-blackness should never be understood as a model. Our OB and why not evidence indicates that resistance is more likely to shape the political institutions. The racial formation codifies upon race. The example of the Rockefeller laws that were pushed by the black middle class proves that it's not just essential to identity, that political formations also impose upon race, which means that it's obviously necessary for us to consider the political formation before anything acts. The role of the ballot is obviated, and it's arbitrary. It just replaces impact calculus for link debating, which means that the role of the ballot is just whoever did the better debating. They say legalization is a social process. Yes, legalization includes some social practice, but does not mean constructivism is the best approach. Predictability rests upon regulation of prostitution. Their only interpretation of legalization are not about prostitution, which means that the context of predictability should prefer or interpretation under their interpretation, reframing any understanding of how legalization occurs. The topical things like Baylor's, PAS, Michigan's affirmation of queer death, or anything that focuses on accessibility. All of these cases only prove that legalization and counter-interpretations that are not fitted around specific interpretations of the topic means that they can be decontextualized and avoid clash because they compete around arguments that are fundamentally unpredictable and based on spin. Going for an extremism impact does not mean that means that their solvency mechanism and explanatory rules need to be linked to their advocacy. All of these demonstrate that the approaches to debate are no longer constrained by best arguments with the greatest academic merit positions that are vague, which internally turn to majority of their offense. They say neoliberalism results in passing racist laws. Antagonisms may be true of all places, but laws have different ideological sets, which means the question of an essential state category should not be relevant to re-articulation of history through things like civil rights, prison reforms, battles against the welfare state, which are moved evidence says are counter-hegemonic struggles for all examples of how we can disarticulate neoliberal policies with the essential practices of the state. You also don't have to defend the state in its entirety by thinking that it's still a good idea. They say disembodied politics ignores the way that resistance shapes the function of those political formations that was explained above. Progress is not the only articulation of social life, like the Borg in Star Trek, which assimilates all in charge to carve out a social territory, which is not the way that we should approach politics. The idea that the only productive politics is the politics of respectability is fundamentally bankrupt. A lot of this was was done by the grant evidence and the OB Why Not evidence, but they've conceded the argument that respect for argument constraint is not the same thing as respect for sexuality, which means that criticism of sexual respectability is not intrinsic to their link argument. The metaphors to topicality should be rejected or independent reason to revoke. Negative trauma is an unknowable experience, so a metaphoric relationship to topicality is bad. Their moral panic to said doesn't apply. The topic obviously is not neutral, but they've agreed on some procedural constraints like speech order and speech time, which means the arbitrary distinction that they isolate is irrelevant. Deliberation is obviously not impossible, does not force homogenizations. We have different relationships to the state under neoliberalism. Doesn't mean that all relationships are bad. Their reaming arguments don't solve our limits argument. Their solvency is based on cultural critique rather than changing the legal status of prostitution. We don't get any counter positions based on nuanced legal status of prostitution. T version of viewing sex as work and applying labor laws is defended by our grant evidence proves that you can criticize current stigmas associated with prostitution, criticize focus on public violence, and while at the same time defending legal change of the status of prostitution. All what we're asking you to do is defend legalization of prostitution, which means it doesn't force you to disembody yourself, just forces you to take an opinion. Counterpoint. Not going for a concede the permutation, just for a reason to reject the argument, not the team picks, or good. Rejecting the argument solves our offense means that we're not stealing anything. Topicality comes as a prerequisite, obviously. The key to test the affirmative action picks we just say no to the entire app that teaches us to disagree, but we never agree with nuance. Nuance is an impactor to all of their picks bad arguments necessary to test all aspects of the affirmative counter-interpretation. Solve being textually and functionally competitive pictures means that we're not stealing. The app is they always get carved out of solve and suggests tactical is indefensible. Forcing us to say prostitution bad or trafficking media is always concessionary ground. Allows the app to base the entire 1AC on basing those strategy, beating those strategy. Picks are good. Picks good doesn't solve any of our team impacts that are about predictable limits and stasis.
135.
Okay.
I'm gonna say some case things, but I'm not gonna do this. It just makes more
Okay.
organizational sense.
Cool beans.
I'll just write it down.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. You're so kind.
I think the secret ingredient in those cookies is crack.
I hope not.
They're all like
I really hope not. This is gonna get really weird then in about
So-
30 minutes.
That's all I can think about.
But maybe.
But that was before the cookies, too.
Live stream audience, there are no crack in my cookies.
That we know of.
That we never had. Unknown unknowns.
It's not a cookie, it's a wafer.
You might bring me that one.
Yep, I got it.
Mhm.
Pretty good.
We are from counter-hegemony politics for our young comes up with big example historical representation design, how they come out of material, linguistic, rebuttal, training, understood, sex, which is social practice, which is constant, consistent with the current mentality framing, you have considered the concepts which we are, the framework for your conception, the concepts means that we have an exclusion disadvantage because it is explicit, this is the black, people are not the commercial, sex worker, i.e. with your topical version of the app, would leave it out our totally our interpretation of for an understanding of how these bodies are sexualized and how their labor is commodified and how the labor is strategically maneuvered to critique capitalism. That's evidence to charge the argument because it says that we have to understand the social, political, economic, cultural context of prostitution and understand how history has operated. You can go to the total framework and use your frame. You're all looking at impact arguments in terms of two
not about legalizations, i.e. regulations, but rather about how the law operates on social terrain and policing. And you, it's a question of competing methods. So we say that your method is not your method is not mutually exclusive, because we do not say that institutions are bad, but rather the beloved community is an institution, which is a continued warning argument that also says that we can agitate the state, i.e. by challenging things like respectability policies, the contextualizations of the piece of balance of evidence spread in the 2AC that says the precursor to changing the shit on the books in DC is challenging things like respectability politics, because it will, if not, it will lead to the McClintock evidence we read in the 1AC that says that it will be a policing space, it will be a regurgitation of how blackness isn't necessarily commodified. And you have conceded the Turner evidence that's going to be damning for you, because the Turner evidence is permutation solvency. It says that the accumulation of skills can be used for instrumental or emotional responses, which means that we get inroads to our libidinal economy arguments. We understand violence operates in libidinal, linguistic, and material economy. Your topical version, you have to stop, come close to grips with that, which is why we're going to win the Topicality debate. You say it's a question of ground. We say that you could have read a supply and demand link for treaties. You have uniqueness, because this is the 1AC. This is the cross of the 2AC. That if more black women are selling as opposed to 1AC, that mean you have a perception that we have triggered the Palermo protocol treaty, or you have the perception, you have a supply and demand argument. Look, there are a bunch of other topic disadvantages that can be read in the link to the impact on the app. You say it's a question about predictable ground, but Collins means that predictable ground will flow affirmative. The D should be hard, even if we are a little bit unpredictable. The U should try or die for the kind of epistemology we produce. You can extend the piece of moat evidence that says stateless is thought, i.e. thinking outside of how sovereignty and institutions work at the state level is important. This is back to term impacted by the James evidence indicates that it thought is kind of important to understand how privateer violence operates. Well, the modes of violence that happen on innate level. Now, reasonability means the search of the best topic is unproductive and only favors the negative. It's the ash job to be somewhat strategic, and as long as we're giving a set of negative arguments that are not impossible to negate the 1AC, you should not punish us with the politics of unrespectability. You could have done one thing better. You could have used the law. The 1AC is not anti-institutions, but rather institutions are not just the fucking state or the federal government. The subject the negative gets a mechanism that links is just proven when we went out our interpretation of legalization, saying that they get links about the law. Begs the question of what is the law, and the law is the only thing to legalize. We do provide a mechanism, which is the way that people think about prostitution. You could have impact turn. I'm not going to go for the pics off, and I'm not going to go for the pics off. So you say topical version of the app. Already actually answered above what the topical version of the app does not solve the 1AC without challenging respectability. Politics is a prior question. This is a sequencing argument, which means that you cannot create a world in which pleasure is realized or way materiality operates, because you only link to things like health regulations and more policing of black women. You think things like taxation, which takes money out of their pockets. You think that leads to things like anti-community building, because you provide autonomy in the system of the state, which is our definition antithetical to the 1AC pieces of young evidence. You say anti-blacks is not monolith. We do not understand anti-blacks is monolith. Our argument about racial rape is the positionality and fungibility of black women is where our agency gets commodified, that we produce for our family, but civil society robs us of the James evidence says we can exist in a form of maroon, i.e. the word managed democracy, which means that we can impact on all of their deliberation and dialoguism arguments, because we create a space where public deliberation can actually happen. That there's no way of mutual exclusivity, that permutation will resolve, but they have to prove that the emotional response of the Turner evidence, or that an understanding of the law is living, is insufficient to solve the affirmative. That even if it's necessary to engage institutions, they have conceded that the engaging of institutions is possible, doing things like the beloved community and agitating the state, like things the civil rights movement, which is just a movement of legalization of employment rights, but rather a bunch of black people agitating for the censure, which is not inconsistent with the 1AC. That you say legalization is a question, you have not answered the legalization is a question of social processes. Our evidence is in the context of how the social terrains operate, which is sufficient. You say trauma is a knowable deliberation, it's not inevitable. Look, you've conceded consistently in the 2 and R concede the term